Rain slashed against the clerestory windows of St. Jude's, casting fractured, bruise-coloured light across the stone floor. Carmen felt the deep vibration of the church organ in her molars. It hummed through the soles of her satin slippers, travelling up legs that felt less like flesh and bone and more like hollow reeds. Her dress weighed 40 pounds. It was a fortress of ivory duchesse satin, seeded with pearls that dug into her collarbones, undergirded by a whalebone corset, laced so ruthlessly she had been taking shallow, sipping breaths since dawn. The air in the cathedral was thick, choking. It smelled of melting beeswax, wet wool from the crowded pews, and the sickly sweet decay of 3,000 white lilies forced into early bloom. Beside her stood Philip, Duke of Somerset. He smelled of bay rum, starched linen, and the faint sour tang of nervous sweat. He was a handsome man, if one liked faces that looked stamped from old coinage. Carmen did not love him. She had never been asked to. She was promised to him in the cradle to settle a land dispute regarding a sprawling, useless marsh on the border of their father's estates. Love was a fiction sold to housemaids in penny dreadfuls. Marriage was an acquisition of property. Carmen was the property. She accepted this. She had built her entire identity around it. "Do you, Philip Henry?" the Archbishop droned, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling like a trapped bird. "Take this woman." Carmen stared straight ahead at the golden altar cross. She mentally counted the steps to the carriage. She thought about how the first thing she would do as the Duchess of Somerset was loosen her stays. Just an inch. Just enough to let her lungs expand fully. Philip did not answer. The silence stretched. It was not a cinematic, breathless pause. It was awkward. It was the sound of 300 people simultaneously realizing something was wrong. Someone in the third pew coughed. A child dropped a wooden toy, the clatter deafening on the flagstones. Carmen shifted her gaze to her left. Philip's jaw was clenched tight enough to crack enamel. A muscle feathered wildly in his cheek. He wasn't looking at the Archbishop. He wasn't looking at Carmen. He was looking over Carmen's right shoulder. Slowly, fighting the rigidity of her pearl-encrusted collar, Carmen turned her head. Standing 2 paces behind her was Beatrice, her younger sister, the maid of honor. Beatrice, in her soft, spun sugar-pink silk, looking like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Tears were spilling over Beatrice's thick, dark lashes, tracking silently down her perfectly flushed cheeks. Her chest heaved. She was staring back at Philip with the raw, unabashed desperation of a drowning victim looking at a rope. "Oh," Carmen thought. The word was perfectly flat in her mind. "Your Grace," the Archbishop prompted, his tone lowering into a warning. Philip moved. He didn't speak. He stepped back, the leather heel of his boot scraping harshly against the stone. The sound felt violent. He turned his body entirely away from Carmen, presenting his broad, velvet-clad shoulder to her, and reached out his hand. Beatrice let out a sound. It wasn't a gasp. It was a sob, wet and broken. She dropped her bouquet of pink roses. They hit the floor with a soft, pathetic thud. She took a step forward, entirely ignoring Carmen, and placed her small, gloved hand into the Duke's. A collective, shuddering inhale ripped through the congregation. The bishop lowered his holy book. Carmen did not faint. She did not scream. She did not slap him. Her overwhelming, immediate sensation was one of profound irritation. The corset was slicing into her floating ribs. Her head throbbed from the heavy silver tiara pinned mercilessly into her scalp. She looked down at her own empty, white-gloved hands resting against the voluminous expanse of her skirt. "I cannot," Philip said. His voice cracked. It wasn't deep and commanding. It was thin, cowardly. "I cannot do this before God. It is Beatrice. It has always been Beatrice." Carmen looked at him, really looked at him. She noticed, for the first time, that he chewed his lower lip when he was frightened. She noticed the slight receding of his hairline. She noticed that the man who held her sister's hand was not a titan of the aristocracy, but a terrified boy who had waited until the absolute maximum point of public humiliation to find his spine. "Philip," Carmen said. Her voice was perfectly level. It did not tremble. It sounded exactly as it did when she ordered tea from the housekeeper. "You are standing on my train." He flinched, looking down as if her dress had caught fire, and hurriedly stepped off the ivory satin. "Right!" her father's voice boomed, shattering the paralyzed silence of the church. Lord Richard Hastings practically vaulted out of the front pew, his face the color of a bruised plum. "Into the vestry. Now. All of you. Move." The vestry was a small, octagonal room that smelled sharply of damp stone and spilled communion wine. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the deafening roar of the congregation's sudden, chaotic whispering. But the silence inside the room was worse. Carmen stood in the center. The room was too small for her dress. The satin crushed against a dark wooden table and an old standing wardrobe. She felt like a parade float parked in a closet. Her mother, Margaret, was leaning against the stone wall, hyperventilating into a lace handkerchief. The scent of her harsh ammonia-smelling salts cut through the stifling air, burning the inside of Carmen's nose. Beatrice was pressed into the corner, still clutching Philip's arm as if he were a shield. She wouldn't stop crying. It was the wet, hiccuping crying of a child who knows they have done wrong, but still wants to be comforted for it. "Are you out of your God-forsaken mind?" Lord Hastings roared. Flecks of spit flew from his lips, landing on the lapel of Philip's coat. "You humiliate my family in front of half the House of Lords. You pull a stunt like this at the altar." "I apologize, Lord Hastings," Philip said, though he was standing slightly behind Beatrice, letting the younger, slighter girl take the brunt of the older man's fury. "But my heart, your heart." Lord Hastings laughed, a bark of pure, venomous disbelief. "You think I care about your heart? We have a contract, Somerset, signed when your father was alive. The northern marshlands for my daughter, Carmen." "I am still taking a daughter," Philip said weakly. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Beatrice and I, we fell in love during the summer at the Lake Estate. I tried to suppress it. I tried to do my duty. But when I saw Carmen at the altar, I realized it would be a sin to marry one sister while my soul belongs to the other." Carmen watched them. It was like watching a play performed by remarkably bad actors. A summer romance at the Lake Estate. Of course. Carmen hadn't gone to the Lake Estate. She had stayed in London, sitting through endless fittings, managing the guest lists, negotiating with the caterers. She had been doing the work of a duchess while the Duke was teaching her sister how to row a boat. She slowly reached up to her face. She hooked a finger under the edge of her heavy lace veil and pulled it off, carelessly dropping it onto the vestry table. Everyone stopped arguing and looked at her. "Carmen," Beatrice choked out. "Carmen, I am so sorry. I didn't mean... We didn't want to hurt you. It just happened." Carmen looked at her sister, Beatrice, 19 years old to Carmen's 24. Beatrice, who had always been allowed to run barefoot in the gardens, while Carmen was made to sit with a book on her head to improve her posture. Beatrice, who got away with murder because she had the decency to look deeply remorseful afterward. "When did it happen exactly?" Carmen asked. "Carmen, please don't," Philip started. "I am not asking you, Philip." Carmen cut him off. The sharpness of her tone made him snap his mouth shut. She looked back at Beatrice. "When?" "August," Beatrice whispered, staring at the floor. "The night of the Harvest Festival." August. 6 months ago. 6 months of Philip sitting across from Carmen in drawing rooms, discussing the placement of the new rose bushes at his estate, knowing full well he was sleeping with her sister. 6 months of Beatrice helping Carmen choose the very satin that was currently cutting off her circulation, telling her how beautiful she would look. Carmen didn't feel heartbroken. The space in her chest where her heart resided felt entirely empty, scoured clean by a blistering, freezing wind. What she felt was a terrifying, feral rage, not at the loss of the man, but at the theft of her time, her dignity, Her entire life's purpose, carefully constructed over 2 decades, dismantled in seconds by 2 cowards who couldn't keep their hands to themselves. "You couldn't have mentioned this yesterday," Carmen asked. Her voice was dangerously soft. "Before I was strapped into a corset so tight I can taste copper. Before 300 people traveled across the country to watch me be discarded like old fruit." "Carmen, mind your tone," her mother snapped weakly from the wall, habit overriding the crisis. "A lady does not—" "A lady?" Carmen whipped her head toward her mother. "I am not a lady today, mother. I am the punchline to a joke the entire peerage is currently laughing at." She turned her back on them. She couldn't look at them anymore. The smell of Philip's sweat, Beatrice's cloying rosewater perfume, her father's stale cigar smoke, it was making her actively nauseous. She placed her hands flat on the cold oak table. The wood was rough, grounding. "So, what is the plan, father?" Carmen asked the wall. "The Duke needs the marshlands to access the river. You need the Duke's political backing in Parliament. The contract says he marries a Hastings." Lord Hastings fell silent. Carmen heard the slow, dreadful shifting of his boots on the stone floor. She knew exactly what he was calculating. He didn't see 2 daughters. He saw a broken asset and a viable spare. "The bishop is still out there," Lord Hastings muttered, his voice dropping the fury, replacing it with cold, hard pragmatism. "The guests are seated. The feast is paid for." "No," Margaret gasped. "Richard, you cannot." Carmen is ruined," Richard hissed back, though loud enough for everyone to hear. "Jilted at the altar. Damaged goods. No decent man of title will touch her now. If Somerset walks out of here without a ring on a Hastings finger, we lose the alliance, and we become a laughingstock with nothing to show for it." Carmen closed her eyes. The darkness behind her eyelids offered no comfort. He was right. That was the brutal, unvarnished truth of their world. She was broken machinery. Beatrice was the shiny new replacement. "Go then," Carmen said. "Carmen?" Beatrice's voice was small, trembling. Carmen turned around. She looked at Philip. He looked immensely relieved, though he was trying to hide it behind a mask of solemnity. He was weak. He would make a terrible husband. He would crumble under pressure, and Beatrice would spend her life making excuses for him. "Go," Carmen repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Get back out there. Marry him. Take my dress, if you can fit into it, Beatrice. Take my title. Take the marshlands." She stepped forward, reaching up to the diamond and pearl tiara woven into her hair. It was pinned tightly. She didn't care. She yanked it. Several hairpins pulled free, dragging strands of her dark hair out by the roots. A sharp sting of pain brought water to her eyes, but she blinked it away. She thrust the tiara into Beatrice's chest. The younger girl reflexively grabbed it, her fingers brushing Carmen's. Beatrice's hands were shaking. Carmen's were perfectly still. "Carmen, how will you get home?" her mother asked, wringing her hands. "I will take the carriage we arrived in," Carmen said, brushing past them toward the heavy oak door. "You all have a wedding to attend." She opened the door. The low roar of the congregation spilled back into the vestry. She stepped out into the side corridor, avoiding the main nave, her massive white dress dragging heavily over the cold stone, leaving a trail of crushed pearls in her wake. The carriage ride back to the Hastings estate was the quietest hour of Carmen's life. The vehicle, meant to transport the bride and her parents, was massive and hollow. It smelled of damp leather and the stale lavender sachets stuffed into the upholstery. Carmen sat in the center of the plush bench, staring at the opposing seat. Her scalp throbbed where she had ripped the tiara free. A single strand of hair hung limply across her face. She didn't brush it away. She looked out the window. The rain had turned into a fine, miserable mist. The carriage rolled past rolling green fields and dark, skeletal trees. It was the same landscape she had looked at her entire life, but it felt entirely foreign now. Up until an hour ago, she had been Carmen Hastings, future Duchess of Somerset. She had known exactly where she would live, what silver patterns she would use, what schools her future sons would attend. Now she was a void, a blank space. She had no title, no husband, and, as her father had so helpfully pointed out, no prospects. She was 24, an old maid by society's standards, heavily tainted by the scandal of being discarded at the altar. She would be the maiden aunt, the spinster sister hidden away in a drafty wing of the estate, meant to knit quiet things and pretend she didn't exist. The carriage pulled into the gravel drive of the estate. The house was enormous, Georgian brick, symmetrical and imposing. It was completely silent. The servants were all at the church, managing the reception that Carmen had spent 6 months planning. The reception that Beatrice and Philip were currently enjoying. Carmen stepped out of the carriage without waiting for the footman, who looked utterly bewildered to see the bride returning alone. She didn't look at him. She gathered handfuls of the heavy satin and dragged herself up the wide stone steps, through the massive front doors, and into the grand foyer. The house echoed. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like hammer strikes. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom. It was a beautiful room, decorated in pale blues and creams. It was the room she was supposed to leave today, never to sleep in again. Her trunks were packed and sitting in the corner, labelled with a crest that no longer belonged to her. Carmen stood in the centre of the room. The adrenaline that had sustained her in the church was evaporating, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She needed to get the dress off. She reached behind her, trying to find the hooks and eyes that ran down the back of the bodice. Her fingers were clumsy. The silk loops were tiny and tight. She managed to undo the top 3 before her arms cramped from the awkward angle. Panic, sudden and utterly irrational, flared in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The corset was a vice. She was trapped in the dress. She pulled at the front of the bodice, the heavy fabric resisting her completely. "Help!" she whispered to the empty room. She walked to the bell pull to summon her maid, but her hand stopped mid-air. Her maid, Lucy, was at the church, helping Beatrice. Carmen dropped her hand. She walked over to her vanity. She picked up a heavy silver pair of sewing scissors. They were cold against her palm. She reached behind her, grabbed a fistful of the expensive silk lacing that held the back of the dress together, and brought the scissors up. It was awkward, blind work. The blades caught on the thick satin, chewing rather than cutting. She twisted her shoulder, biting her lip against the strain, and snipped blindly. With a sharp pop, a row of stitches gave way. Carmen dropped the scissors. She dug her fingers into the gap she had created and pulled. The heavy silk tore with a loud, violent rip. The sound was incredibly satisfying in the quiet room. She tore it again, ruining hundreds of pounds worth of fabric, destroying months of a seamstress's labour. She didn't care. She yanked the dress forward, letting it slide off her shoulders, scraping against her skin, until the 40-pound monstrosity pooled around her ankles like a deflated cloud. She stepped out of it, leaving it dead on the floor. Underneath, she wore a chemise and the brutal, structured corset. She managed to reach the laces of the corset, untying the knot and pulling the strings loose. The rigid whalebone gave way. Carmen took a breath. Her lungs expanded. Her ribs cracked softly as they settled back into their natural position. She looked down at her torso. Deep, angry red welts lined her pale skin where the boning had dug into her flesh. She traced one of the lines with a shaking finger. It was sore to the touch. She walked over to the edge of her bed and sat down. The mattress groaned slightly under her weight. It was over. The wedding was over. Her life, as she knew it, was over. And then, her stomach growled. The sound was so incredibly mundane, so loud in the quiet room, that Carmen startled. She hadn't eaten since yesterday evening, too nervous about fitting into the dress. Her body, completely indifferent to the catastrophic ruin of her social standing and future, was demanding sustenance. The sheer absurdity of it struck her. Her life had just burned to the ground, and her biology was asking for a sandwich. Carmen brought a hand to her mouth. A sound escaped her. A sharp, breathy noise. It wasn't a sob. It was a laugh. It started small, a choked snort that hurt her raw throat, and then it grew. She sat on the edge of her childhood bed, in her underwear, bruised and discarded, and she laughed until her ribs ached. It was a dark, jagged, cynical sound. She laughed at Philip's terrified face. She laughed at her father's instant, bloodless calculation. She laughed at the thought of Beatrice, currently sweating in the vestry, trying to squeeze into a dress tailored for a woman 3 inches taller and 10 pounds heavier. But as the laughter peaked, it cracked. It fractured down the middle, the sharp edges turning inward. The jagged breaths hitched. The laughter died, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than before. Carmen sat hunched over, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress until her knuckles turned white. She stared at the pile of ruined white silk on the floor. A single, hot tear broke free, slipping down her cheek and dripping off her jaw, splashing onto her bare knee. She wasn't crying because she had lost Philip. She didn't care about Philip. She was crying because she looked at the empty room, listened to the ticking clock, and realized she had absolutely no idea who the woman sitting on the bed was. Carmen woke to the sound of rain steadily drumming against the glass, a monotonous rhythm that felt like a continuation of yesterday's nightmare. She was lying on top of her bed covers, still in her chemise and loose corset. The ruined wedding dress remained exactly where it had fallen, a crumpled heap of dead silk in the center of the rug. Her mouth tasted like old pennies. Her ribs throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. She sat up, the joints in her knees cracking in the quiet room. She didn't ring for Lucy. The thought of facing the maid's pity, the downturned eyes, the gentle, maddeningly slow way she would brush Carmen's hair, was unbearable. Instead, Carmen walked to her wardrobe. Her fingers brushed past the light, pastel muslins she usually wore. She bypassed the vibrant riding habits. She reached into the far back and pulled out a day dress of dark, heavy slate wool. It was a severe garment, meant for visiting ailing tenants in the dead of winter. It felt appropriate. It buttoned up the front, requiring no assistance. Carmen fastened it, pulling her hair back into a tight, severe knot at the nape of her neck. She looked in the mirror. Her face was pale, the skin under her eyes bruised with exhaustion, but her jaw was set. She looked like a governess. She looked like a woman who expected nothing. The house outside her bedroom was eerily quiet, but it smelled of the invasion. As Carmen descended the main staircase, the scent of stale cigar smoke, spilled brandy, and fading perfume clung to the tapestries. The remnants of a wedding feast she hadn't attended. The foyer floor was scuffed with muddy boot prints. She bypassed the dining room, where she knew her parents would be nursing their respective headaches, and pushed through the heavy baize door that led to the servants' quarters. The kitchen was a chaotic landscape of unwashed china and half-eaten cold meats. The scullery maids were up to their elbows in greasy water. When Carmen walked in, the clatter of silverware stopped abruptly. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the room. Cook, a formidable woman with flour on her nose, froze with a meat cleaver in the air. "Good morning, Mrs. Bridges," Carmen said. Her voice was flat, betraying nothing. "Miss Carmen," the cook breathed, lowering the cleaver. "We didn't expect... That is, your mother said you wouldn't be down. My mother is incorrect." Carmen walked past the frozen staff toward the large oak work table. She picked up a clean plate and a fork. She served herself a thick slice of cold roast beef, a scoop of hardened potatoes, and a wedge of sharp cheddar. "I will eat in the morning room. Please have someone bring up a pot of black tea. Strong." She turned and left the kitchen. Behind her, the whispers ignited, like dry brush catching fire. The morning room was cold. The fire had not been lit. Carmen sat at the small table and ate the cold, tough beef. It required intense chewing. She focused entirely on the mechanics of it. Bite, chew, swallow. It grounded her. The door creaked open. Carmen didn't look up. Carmen? It was Beatrice. She was wearing a traveling gown of deep navy velvet, the very gown Carmen had selected for her own honeymoon trip to the continent. The bodice was too tight across Beatrice's chest, the fabric straining slightly at the seams. Beatrice hovered in the doorway, smelling strongly of Philip's heavy bay rum cologne. The scent made Carmen's stomach pitch. "I'm packing," Beatrice said softly, stepping into the room. She twisted her hands together. On her left ring finger sat the heavy gold and ruby band of the Somerset matriarchs. It was too loose. It slid awkwardly toward her knuckle. "Philip is waiting in the carriage. We are leaving for the country estate." Carmen took another bite of beef. She chewed. She swallowed. She laid her fork down, the silver clicking sharply against the porcelain. "Have a safe journey," Carmen said. Beatrice flinched, as if Carmen had thrown the plate at her. "Please don't look at me like that. Or speak to me like that. Be angry, Carmen. Yell at me. Call me a whore. Call me a thief. Just don't be so blank." "I am eating my breakfast, Beatrice," Carmen said, picking up her fork again. "I find yelling interferes with my digestion. I love him." Beatrice's voice cracked, tears brimming instantly. It was her default defense. If she cried, the world softened. "I didn't plan it. We tried to stop. But when we were together, it felt like fate." Carmen looked at her sister. She looked past the tears and the trembling lip. She saw the girl who used to steal Carmen's ribbons and hide them, only to cry when confronted until their father scolded Carmen for upsetting the child. "Fate," Carmen echoed. The word tasted ridiculous. Fate is a very convenient word for poor impulse control. "You never loved him," Beatrice accused, her tone shifting, a defensive edge creeping into her wet voice. "You only cared about the title. You treated him like a ledger entry." "And you treat him like a lapdog," Carmen countered evenly. "But he is your lapdog now. Be sure to remind him to chew his food, Beatrice. He has a habit of swallowing whole when he's nervous." Beatrice stared at her, her mouth slightly open. She looked down at the ill-fitting ring on her finger. "I am sorry, Carmen. Truly." "Goodbye, Your Grace," Carmen said, deliberately using the title. It landed like a physical blow. Beatrice turned pale, spun on her heel, and hurried out of the room. A few moments later, Carmen heard the heavy oak front doors close, followed by the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. The tea arrived. Carmen poured a cup. It was scalding hot and bitter. It was the best thing she had tasted in days. By Tuesday, the house had settled into a grim, oppressive routine. Lord Hastings avoided Carmen entirely, retreating to his study with a decanter of whiskey. Her mother had taken to her bed, claiming a severe nervous prostration, leaving the management of the sprawling household entirely to the daughter they had just declared utterly useless. Carmen didn't mind. The work was a wall she could hide behind. She counted linens. She reviewed the butcher's bills. She ordered the muddy carpets in the foyer to be beaten and scrubbed. She fired a footman who she caught making a joke about the spinster bride in the scullery. She did it quietly, efficiently, and without a severance. She was in the library, a massive, drafty room lined with rotting, leather-bound books, checking the estate's quarterly agricultural returns, when the door opened. It wasn't a servant. The man who walked in was tall, sharp-shouldered, and entirely unfamiliar. He wore a dark wool suit that was well made but slightly frayed at the cuffs. He smelled of damp wool, pipe tobacco, and the sharp metallic tang of train smoke. He carried a battered leather briefcase. "I apologize," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that startled her. He didn't sound like the gentry that usually occupied this house. He sounded like a man who worked for a living. The front door was open. No one was in the hall. "The staff is currently scrubbing the scullery floor," Carmen said, not closing the ledger. "Who are you?" "Garrett Hastings," he said, stepping further into the room. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair severely parted to the side. "I am the junior partner at Finch and Finch, Lord Hastings' solicitors. I was summoned regarding the sudden alteration to the Somerset marriage settlements." Carmen's pen stopped scratching against the paper. She looked up at him. Hastings looked back. His eyes were a dark, flat grey, completely devoid of the pity Carmen had seen in every other face over the past 4 days. He looked at her the way one might look at a load-bearing beam in a house, assessing its structural integrity. "My father is in his study," Carmen said. "Down the hall, last door on the right. You will likely find him asleep, or drunk, or both." Hastings' eyebrows ticked upward, just a fraction. He set his briefcase down on a leather wingback chair. "I see. And you are Miss Carmen Hastings?" "I am." "I was told you were indisposed." "I am doing the accounts," Carmen said, gesturing to the heavy book with the feathered end of her quill. "Does that look like an indisposition to you, Mr. Hastings?" Hastings walked closer to the desk. He leaned over slightly, looking at the upside-down columns of numbers. "No, it looks like double-entry bookkeeping, although you've miscalculated the grain yield for the western acreage by about 4%. You forgot to account for the rot in the lower silos." Carmen frowned, pulling the ledger closer. She scanned the numbers, doing the math in her head. She hated that he was right. 3.5%, she corrected, dipping her pen in the inkwell and slashing a line through the final tally. "Close enough," Hastings said. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "Lord Hastings summoned me to draft the formal transfer of the marshlands to the Duke of Somerset, and to adjust your younger sister's dowry." "She already took my groom and my dress," Carmen said, her voice dry as dust. "She might as well take the money too." Hastings tilted his head, watching her carefully. "You are remarkably pragmatic about being publicly humiliated, Miss Hastings." Carmen looked up, meeting his grey eyes. "Weeping will not bring back my social standing, Mr. Hastings, nor will it return the 6 months of my life I wasted planning a wedding for 2 people who lack the moral spine of a jellyfish. I prefer to deal in realities." "The reality," Hastings said, his tone turning brisk and professional, "is that Lord Hastings is attempting to liquidate your personal dowry trust to offset the cost of the marshland transfer. He intends to roll your funds into Beatrice's settlement to appease the Duke's bankers." Carmen went very still. The quill in her hand hovered over the inkwell. A drop of black ink fell, splattering against the mahogany desk. "My dowry," Carmen repeated. The words felt heavy. "The funds left by my maternal grandmother." "Yes," Hastings said. He unclasped his briefcase, pulling out a thick sheaf of legal parchment. "Legally, until you marry, your father controls the trust. He can reallocate it as he sees fit for the betterment of the family estate." Carmen felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. It wasn't sadness. It was the familiar, feral rage returning, sharp and clear. They hadn't just taken her future. They were coming for her safety net. Without that trust, she was entirely dependent on her father's charity. She would be a beggar in her own home, forced to ask for pennies to buy a new pair of stockings. "He cannot do that," Carmen said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Legally he can," Hastings corrected, tapping the parchment. "Unless you contest it, which would require a public legal battle. More scandal." Hastings was testing her. She could see it in the flat set of his jaw. He expected her to balk at the word scandal. He expected her to lower her eyes and accept her ruin. Carmen stood up. She closed the ledger with a loud final snap. Dust motes danced in the air around them. "Mr. Hastings," Carmen said, stepping around the desk. She was suddenly hyper-aware of how she looked. Severe, unadorned, hardened. "Good. Take me to my father." The study smelled of spilled port and old dog. Lord Hastings was sitting behind his massive desk, his face flushed, eyes bloodshot. He looked up in irritation as Hastings entered the room, his annoyance spiking into pure, volatile anger when Carmen followed the lawyer inside. "What are you doing in here?" Lord Hastings barked, sitting up straighter. "This is business, Carmen. Go back to your knitting." "I don't knit, father," Carmen said, pulling a leather chair out and sitting down directly across from him. She didn't wait for an invitation. She crossed her hands in her lap. Her knuckles were white, but her voice was steady. "I do, however, Read balance sheets. Mr. Hastings and I have been discussing my dowry. Lord Hastings shot a furious glare at the lawyer. Hastings stood near the fireplace, casually resting his arm on the mantelpiece, looking entirely unbothered by the hostility. He looked like a spectator at a moderately interesting dogfight. "There is nothing to discuss," Lord Hastings said, waving a thick, dismissive hand. "The trust is being reallocated. Somerset's bankers are demanding a larger liquid capital injection since Beatrice's original dowry was smaller than yours. We have to secure the marshlands, Carmen. It's politics." "It's theft," Carmen corrected calmly. "You are stealing from the daughter you ruined to pay the daughter who ruined me." "Watch your mouth!" Lord Hastings slammed his fist on the desk. The inkwell rattled. "You are living under my roof, eating my food. You are a disgraced spinster who will never leave this house. You don't need a dowry. What are you going to buy? More black dresses?" The words were meant to cut, to break her down into the sobbing, pliable woman she was supposed to be. Carmen felt the sting, a sharp phantom pain in her chest, but she locked it away in a dark box in her mind. "I will not live in this house," Carmen said. Her father laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And where will you go? The streets? A convent?" Carmen looked at Hastings. The lawyer was watching her intently, a faint spark of genuine curiosity in his grey eyes. "Blackwood? No." Carmen caught herself. "The old Oakhaven property," she said, pulling the name of her grandmother's abandoned estate from her memory. "The sheep farm on the Yorkshire coast. It produces nothing. The house is half ruined. You've been trying to sell it for 5 years and no one will take it." Lord Hastings frowned, confused by the sudden pivot. "Oakhaven is a pile of rocks in a frozen wasteland. What does that have to do with anything?" "Sign the deed of Oakhaven over to me," Carmen demanded. "Sole ownership. Uncontestable. In exchange, I will sign the waiver releasing my grandmother's trust to Beatrice. You get your liquid capital for the Duke. I get the rocks." Silence stretched in the study. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the rain lashing against the window. Lord Hastings stared at her. He was calculating again, weighing the annoyance of his eldest daughter against the desperate need to appease his new son-in-law's bankers. Oakhaven was a financial drain, a useless tract of grazing land with a crumbling manor house that smelled perpetually of wet sheep and salt rot. To give it away was practically doing himself a favour. "You want to live in Yorkshire?" Lord Hastings sneered. "Alone? You'll freeze to death in a month or go mad from the isolation." "I prefer the company of sheep to cowards," Carmen replied. Her father's face purpled. He looked to Hastings. "Is this legal? Can we transfer the deed for the trust waiver?" Hastings pushed off the mantelpiece. He walked to the desk, opening his battered briefcase. "It is highly unorthodox, my lord. But yes, if Miss Hastings signs a formal release of the funds, I can draft a transfer of the Oakhaven deed into her name. She would become an independent property owner." "Do it," Lord Hastings snapped, waving his hand impatiently. "Draft it now. Let her go freeze in Yorkshire. I'm sick of looking at her sour face, reminding me of this whole debacle." Hastings pulled out a blank sheet of vellum and a fountain pen. He began to write, his hand moving in sharp, precise strokes. Carmen watched the ink bleed into the heavy paper. She wasn't breathing. It felt entirely unreal. She was trading a fortune for a ruin, but for the first time in her 24 years of life, the ruin would be hers. No one could dictate what time she ate, what dress she wore, or whose arm she had to hold. "Miss Hastings," Hastings murmured, sliding the document across the desk toward her. "Your signature. Here. And here." Carmen took the pen. The metal barrel was warm from his grip. She looked at her father. He wasn't even looking at her. He was already pouring himself another glass of port, mentally moving on to his next political maneuver. She was already a ghost in this room. She pressed the nib to the paper. Her hand shook, just slightly, a tiny tremor of adrenaline and terror. She forced her wrist down, dragging the pen across the line. Carmen Margaret Hastings. She signed her life away. She signed her freedom into existence. Hastings took the paper, gently blowing on the wet ink to dry it. He neatly folded it and slipped it into his briefcase, pulling out a secondary document, the deed to Oakhaven, and handed it to Carmen. The parchment was stiff and heavy. It smelled faintly of peppermint and train smoke from Hastings' bag. Carmen gripped it so tightly her fingers ached. "I will arrange for a carriage to take you to the train station on Thursday," Lord Hastings said, not looking at her. "Take whatever clothes you want. I won't have you looking like a pauper, even if you act like one." "Thank you, Father," Carmen said softly. She stood up, holding the deed against her thigh. She walked to the door. As she reached for the brass handle, Hastings spoke. "Miss Hastings?" Carmen paused and looked back. The lawyer was packing his briefcase. He paused, looking up at her from under his dark brow. "Oakhaven has a severe leak in the west wing roof," Hastings said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational murmur that excluded her father. "And the tenant farmer, a Mr. Moreau, is skimming off the top of the wool profits. You might want to address that upon your arrival." Carmen stared at him. He had known about the property. He had known it was a trap, a financial sinkhole, and he hadn't stopped her. But he was giving her the ammunition to fix it. The corner of Carmen's mouth twitched, mimicking the tiny, barely there smile he had given her in the library. "I will be sure to count the sheep myself, Mr. Hastings," Carmen said. She opened the door and walked out into the cold, quiet hallway. She didn't look back. She walked up the stairs to her empty room, clutching the piece of paper that proved she existed. Soot coated the roof of Carmen's mouth. The train ride north had taken 14 hours, grinding through an endless, greying landscape that slowly stripped away the manicured hedges of the south, replacing them with jagged stone and bruised heather. She had ridden in a second-class carriage. Her father had provided first-class fare, but Carmen had cashed the ticket in at the station, pocketing the difference. She needed capital, not velvet cushions. By the time the hired trap deposited her at the base of Oakhaven's driveway, the sun had already slipped behind the moors, leaving the sky the colour of a fresh hematoma. Oakhaven was not a manor. It was a fortress that had surrendered to the elements a century ago. Built from dark, native gritstone, it sat atop a treeless rise, taking the full, brutal force of the North Sea wind. Half the roof slates were missing, giving the structure the appearance of a jagged, rotting tooth. The wind screamed through the gaps in the stonework. It was a terrifying, hollow sound. Carmen stood in the mud. The cold was absolute. It bit through her heavy wool coat, sinking directly into her bones. She held a single leather valise. It contained 3 plain dresses, heavy undergarments, a pair of men's riding boots she had stolen from her father's mudroom, and the deed to the property. "You'll be the Hastings girl, then." Carmen turned. A man stood by the crumbling stone gatepost. He wore a heavy, grease-stained waxed coat and a flat cap pulled low over his eyes. He smelled intensely of damp wool, pipe tobacco, and the sharp, sour odour of unwashed bodies. He was chewing on a splinter of wood, looking her up and down with an expression that hovered between amusement and deep, ingrained contempt. "I am Miss Hastings," Carmen said. The wind snatched the words from her mouth, forcing her to speak louder, her voice scraping against her dry throat. "And you are Mr. Moreau?" "Aye. He didn't tip his cap. He didn't offer to take her bag. Got a letter from your father's lawyer. Said you were coming to play country mouse. The main house ain't fit for living, miss. Roof in the west wing caved in 2 winters back. Rots in the floorboards. You'd best be getting back on the train tomorrow." Carmen stared at him. She felt the exhaustion dragging at her muscles, a heavy, leaden weight. Her feet were numb. She wanted to sleep for a week, but she saw the hard, calculating glint in Moreau's small eyes. He was testing her. He expected the spinster bride to burst into tears at the sight of the ruin and run back to London, leaving him to continue managing and bleeding the estate in peace. She gripped the handle of her valise until the leather creaked. "Mr. Moreau," Carmen said. She pitched her voice low, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear her over the wind. "I am not here to play. I own this land. I own the house. I own the grass your sheep graze on. And I own the sheep. Tomorrow morning, at 8 o'clock, you will bring the estate ledgers, the shearing tallies from the last 3 years, and the keys to the outbuildings to the house. Moreau stopped chewing his splinter. The amusement vanished, replaced by a sullen, aggressive set of his jaw. The ledgers are my business. Lord Hastings is in London, drinking himself to death. Carmen cut him off. He is no longer your employer. I am. If you are not in the house by 8 o'clock, you will be evicted by noon. Do you understand? She didn't wait for his answer. She turned her back on him, presenting a target to the hostile man in the dark, and began the long, muddy walk up the drive. Her boots sank an inch deep with every step. The cold wind pushed against her chest, a physical barrier trying to force her back, but she leaned into it. The heavy oak front door of Oakhaven was unlocked. The latch was rusted through. Carmen pushed it open, the hinges screaming in protest. The interior smelled of ancient dust, damp plaster, and dead leaves. The grand foyer was dark, the only light filtering through the grime-caked transoms above the door. Carmen walked into the nearest room, a former parlour. The furniture was covered in decaying sheets. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. She set her bag down. Her hands were shaking violently from the cold. She pulled off her gloves and walked to the fireplace. A small pile of peat and kindling sat in the iron grate, likely left by whoever had last squatted here. She found a tin of matches on the mantelpiece. Her fingers were so numb she dropped 3 matches before she managed to strike one. The flame flared, small and desperate. She touched it to the dry kindling. The fire caught, smoking heavily before the peat began to smoulder. Carmen dragged a sheet-covered armchair closer to the meagre heat. She sat down, ignoring the cloud of dust that billowed up around her. She didn't take off her coat. She leaned forward, holding her raw hands out to the fire. The house creaked and groaned around her in the wind. A rat scurried across the floorboards in the hall. It was the most desolate, miserable place she had ever been. Carmen looked at the small orange glow of the peat. She took a deep breath. The air was freezing, but it belonged to her. For the first time since she had walked away from the altar, she didn't feel the suffocating pressure of a corset. She felt nothing but the cold, and the cold was real. 6 weeks later, Carmen's hands were ruined. The skin across her knuckles was cracked and red, permanently stained with the black ink she used to correct Moreau's abysmal bookkeeping. Her fingernails were clipped short and packed with dirt. She wore the men's riding boots every day, her skirts heavy with dried mud. She had claimed the ground floor library as her headquarters. The roof above it was intact, and the fireplace drew well. She had hired a local woman, Mrs. Gable, a widow with a face like a dried apple, to help clean the 2 habitable rooms and cook thin, starchy meals of potatoes and mutton. Carmen was currently sitting at a massive, scarred oak desk, entirely obscured by a mountain of yellowing receipts and bound ledgers. The air in the library was freezing despite the roaring fire. She was wearing her thickest wool dress and a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and slashed a vicious black line through Moreau's entry for veterinary supplies. "He's stealing," Carmen muttered to the empty room. "He's not even trying to hide it. He charged me for 30 bottles of sheep dip, and the receipts from the apothecary only show 10. She rubbed her burning eyes. Her back ached in a deep structural way. The sheer volume of the fraud was staggering. Moreau had been running Oakhaven as his personal piggy bank for half a decade, capitalizing on her father's utter indifference to the northern estate. A sharp knock at the heavy front door echoed through the quiet house. Carmen froze. Nobody visited Oakhaven. The locals avoided the crumbling manor, and Moreau usually just let himself into the kitchen when he wanted to argue with her. She stood up, her joints protesting, and walked out into the dusty foyer. She pulled the door open, ready to berate whoever had come selling religious tracts or useless trinkets. Garrett Hastings stood on the porch. He was wearing a heavy, dark overcoat that looked slightly damp from the fine Yorkshire mist. His boots were caked in mud. He carried the same battered leather briefcase, but in his other hand, he held a brown paper parcel tied with string. He looked tired, the shadows under his grey eyes more pronounced than they had been in London. but his posture was razor straight. Carmen stared at him. She was acutely aware of her muddy hem, her unpinned hair falling in her face, and the ink stains on her fingers. She didn't try to hide them. "Mr. Hastings," Carmen said, her voice raspy from disuse. "Miss Hastings," Hastings replied. The corner of his mouth twitched, taking in her feral appearance. "I apologize for the unannounced intrusion. The telegraph lines are down past York." "Why are you here?" Finch and Finch required a physical signature on the final land registry documents to register the deed with the Crown. He lifted the briefcase slightly. "And I had other business in Leeds. It seemed prudent to deliver them myself." It was a lie. Leeds was 40 miles away, a brutal carriage ride across the moors. Carmen knew it, and from the flat, steady way he looked at her, she knew he knew she knew. "Come in," Carmen said, stepping aside, "before you let the heat out, though there isn't much to let out." Hastings stepped into the foyer, looking up at the peeling plaster and the water damage staining the ceiling. He didn't make a sound of pity or disgust. He just observed it, like a structural engineer assessing a bridge. Carmen led him into the library. She walked behind the desk and sat down. Hastings took the solitary armchair near the fire, setting his briefcase on the floor. He placed the brown paper parcel on her desk. "What is that?" Carmen asked. "Ceylon tea," Hastings said. "Proper leaves, not the dust they sell at the village mercantile, and a tin of butter biscuits." Carmen looked at the parcel. Her stomach gave a violent, embarrassing lurch at the word biscuits. She looked up at Hastings. "A bribe, Mr. Hastings?" "Provisions, Miss Hastings," he corrected smoothly. "I assume a woman who is currently fighting a war of attrition with a corrupt tenant farmer might forget to eat." Carmen's eyes narrowed. "You knew Moreau was a thief." "I strongly suspected," Hastings said, unbuttoning his overcoat. "Your father's ledgers in London showed a bizarre discrepancy between the wool yield and the market price. But it was not my place to investigate. I merely draft the contracts. And now I am curious," Hastings admitted. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "I wanted to see if the woman who casually discarded a duke and a fortune to freeze in Yorkshire had actually managed to survive a month." Carmen snorted. It wasn't a ladylike sound. It was harsh and exhausted. She pushed a stack of ledgers toward the edge of the desk. "Survive?" "Yes. The estate is bleeding money. Moreau has been skimming 20% off the top for years, padding the expenses and underreporting the lambing yields." Hastings stood up. He walked over to the desk, standing beside her chair. He didn't ask for permission. He leaned over, smelling of cold rain and that faint, sharp metallic scent. He looked at the open ledger, tracing her aggressive black corrections with his index finger. "You've tracked it," he murmured, his voice low, vibrating right next to her ear. It sent a strange, sudden spike of warmth down her spine. "Double entry. You cross-referenced his supply receipts with the village apothecary." "He's an idiot," Carmen said, staring at his finger on the page, acutely aware of the proximity of his body to hers. "He didn't think I would actually read the receipts. He thought I was just a hysterical woman looking for a place to hide." Hastings turned his head. His face was inches from hers. She could see the dark stubble along his jawline, the tiny flecks of silver in his grey irises. He wasn't looking at her like a broken thing. He was looking at her the way one apex predator recognizes another. "You are going to fire him," Hastings said. It wasn't a question. "Tomorrow morning," Carmen confirmed. Her voice was steady, but her pulse was beating frantically against her collarbone. "When he comes to collect his monthly wages," Hastings slowly straightened up, stepping back from the desk. The sudden absence of his heat made the cold in the room sharper. "He will not go quietly. Men like Moreau do not surrender their fiefdoms to women easily. He will get loud. He may get violent." "Let him," Carmen said, leaning back in her chair. I have the sheriff's eviction notice drawn up. I just need to sign it. Hastings watched her for a long moment. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek, heavy silver object. He placed it on the desk next to the salon tea. It was a small, twin-barrel Derringer pistol. Carmen stared at the weapon. The polished steel caught the firelight. I am staying the night at the village inn, Hastings said, picking up his briefcase. I will return tomorrow at 8 to collect the signed registry documents. I trust you will have your affairs in order by then. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out of the library, his boots heavy on the floorboards. Carmen listened to the front door open and close, sealing her back into the freezing house. She reached out and touched the cold metal of the pistol. It was heavy. It was real. He hadn't offered to stay and protect her. He hadn't treated her like a fragile creature needing saving. He had given her the tool to save herself. Carmen smiled. It was a terrifying, genuine expression. The next morning, the rain was a torrential downpour, turning the estate yard into a churning sea of brown muck. Carmen stood under the rotting awning of the main barn. She wore her thickest coat, her hands shoved deep into her pockets, her fingers wrapped tightly around the cold silver handle of the Derringer. The sheriff's deputy, a nervous young man named Hodges, stood a few paces behind her, looking miserable in the rain. Moreau swaggered out of the shearing shed. He wiped his greasy hands on his trousers, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He walked up to Carmen, stopping uncomfortably close. He smelled of sour beer, even at 8 in the morning. Rent day, Miss Hastings, Moreau said, holding out a dirty hand. Though with the rot in the lower pasture, the yield's down again. Won't be much left for the house. Carmen didn't take her hands out of her pockets. She looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No fear, no anger, just the cold, mechanical necessity of removing an obstacle. You are fired, Mr. Moreau, Carmen said. Her voice cut clearly through the sound of the rain. Moreau's smirk vanished. His face darkened, a flush of ugly red creeping up his thick neck. He dropped his hand. What did you say to me, you little... You are fired, Carmen repeated, stepping forward, forcing him to hold his ground or step back. You are a thief and a fraud. I have the ledgers. You have stolen exactly £342 over the last 5 years. You are vacating the tenant cottage by noon, or Deputy Hodges will arrest you for embezzlement. Moreau looked at the deputy. The young man swallowed hard, but rested his hand on his truncheon. Moreau looked back at Carmen. He laughed, a harsh barking sound. You think you can run this place? Moreau spat, taking a sudden, aggressive step toward her. He towered over her, his chest puffed out. A ruined little society bitch? The shearers won't work for you. The buyers in York won't trade with you. You'll be begging me to come back when the flock starves in the winter. Carmen pulled her right hand out of her pocket. The Derringer was incredibly small in her palm, but the twin barrels pointed directly at Moreau's gut. Moreau froze. The breath hitched in his throat. I am not a lady, Mr. Moreau, Carmen said softly. I am a woman with nothing left to lose. Be off my property by noon. Moreau stared at the gun. He looked at Carmen's eyes. He saw the complete lack of hesitation. He slowly backed away, raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. Though his face was pale, he spat in the mud at her feet, turned, and marched toward his cottage. Carmen didn't lower the gun until he was out of sight. Her hand was completely steady. Impressive. Carmen turned. Garrett Hastings was leaning against the side of the barn, sheltered from the rain. He wore a dark suit, holding a black umbrella over his head. He looked entirely out of place in the mud, yet completely grounded. I told you I would handle it, Carmen said, slipping the pistol back into her pocket. You did, Hastings agreed, walking toward her. His boots squelched in the mud. He stopped beside her, offering her the shelter of the umbrella. Carmen didn't move away, though he is right about one thing. The buyers in York are a vicious lot. They will try to fleece you, pardon the pun, when you take the wool to market. I know the market price of wool, Carmen said, looking out at the rain. I've been reading the Financial Times you used as packing paper for the tea. Hastings chuckled. It was a low, warm sound that vibrated in his chest. I have contacts at the exchange in York. Men who owe me favours. I could act as your broker. For a standard fee, of course. Carmen looked up at him. The rain drummed heavily against the taut silk of the umbrella, creating a small, private world around them. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a business arrangement. 5%, Carmen countered. 8, Hastings replied without missing a beat. I have to negotiate with Yorkshiremen. That requires hazard pay. 6.5. And you pay for your own train ticket from London when you come up for the auctions. Hastings looked at her. A slow, genuine smile broke across his face, entirely transforming his sharp features. It made him look younger, less weary. Deal, Miss Hastings. 3 months later, the wind was still howling off the North Sea, but the library at Oakhaven was warm. The roof in the west wing had been patched. The fire roared in the grate, feeding on good dry wood Carmen had purchased with the profits from her first successful wool auction. She sat at her desk, going over the weekly tallies. The estate was not wealthy, but it was solvent. It was hers. Mrs. Gable entered the room, carrying a silver tray with a pot of Ceylon tea and a single letter. Post rider brought this, Mum, the housekeeper said, setting the tray down. Carmen thanked her. She poured the tea, letting the steam warm her face. She picked up the letter. The paper was thick, expensive vellum. The wax seal bore the crest of the Duke of Somerset. Carmen broke the seal with her thumbnail. The handwriting was Beatrice's, frantic, looped, and messy. Carmen, I beg you to write back. It is awful here. Philip is so weak. His mother controls everything. She critiques my clothes, my voice, the way I hold my teacup. Philip just looks at the floor and says nothing. He won't defend me. He spends all his time at his club to avoid the house. I am so lonely. I made a terrible mistake. Please, Carmen, tell me you forgive me. Tell me you will come visit. I need my sister. Beatrice. Carmen read the letter once. She didn't feel a flicker of triumph. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt utterly exhausted by the memory of the people she used to know. They were ghosts, trapped in a gilded cage they had built with their own treachery. She stood up. She walked to the fireplace. She didn't hesitate. She tossed the letter into the flames. The heavy vellum curled, turned brown, and burst into bright orange fire. She watched until the words turned to ash and floated up the chimney. The heavy oak door of the library opened. Garrett Hastings stepped inside. He had arrived from London the night before for the autumn audit. He had left his overcoat in the hall. He walked to the desk, carrying his own stack of ledgers. He looked at Carmen standing by the fire, then at the ashes in the grate. He didn't ask. He never asked. The mutton prices are up in Leeds, Hastings said, dropping the ledgers onto the desk with a heavy thud. He pulled out the armchair and sat down, rolling up his shirt sleeves. If we move the northern flock next week, we can undercut the Scottish sellers. Carmen turned away from the fire. She looked at Hastings, at the ink stains on his fingers, at the sharp, intelligent focus in his eyes. She looked at the room she had fought for, the life she had carved out of mud and ruin. She walked over to the desk. She sat down beside him, pulling the ledger toward her. Show me, Carmen said. They leaned over the numbers together, their shoulders brushing in the quiet, warm room, while outside, the Yorkshire wind beat harmlessly against the stone.